Mobile radio calling?
Yeah.
Got an emergency on the Ocean Ranger?
Yeah.
Just a second. Ocean Ranger, Jack, are you there?
Roger.
Can you give us anything else on it right now?
We're listening badly, and we need to get the people off the rig and get the bodies. We may not be able to hold a rig and rig lights going over. Going about 70, anywhere 35 to 80 miles an hour, and we need to get the people off the rig.
What you just heard was the distress call from the Ocean Ranger oil rig on February 15, 1982. The rig, along with its 84 crew, were caught in a severe North Atlantic cyclone and in big, big trouble. The Ocean Ranger disaster, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. I'm your host, Rich Napolitano. This episode is not a typical shipwreck in the classical sense. We often don't think of offshore oil rigs as vessels, but indeed, they are vessels that float in the water and many even have their own propulsion. The Ocean Ranger was a semi-submersible drilling rig designed by the Ocean Drilling and Exploration Company, commonly referred to as ODECO. It was built at the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Yard in Hiroshima, Japan in 1976, with construction supervised by the American Bureau of Shipping. When completed, ABS rated and approved the Ocean Ranger for unrestricted ocean operations and was designed to withstand extremely harsh environmental conditions. The rig was rated to handle simultaneous 100-knot winds, 3-knot surface current, and 110-foot waves. This mobile, ocean-going oil rig was massive, at 398 feet 9 inches long, 262 feet wide, and 151 feet 6 inches high, with its derrick, or tower, soaring another 180 feet above the platform. It was the world's largest semi-submersible oil rig at the time. The upper hull consisted of an upper platform deck and a lower platform deck. These areas included work areas, storage, generator room, and living quarters. Supporting the upper hull were 8 vertical columns, each one 134 feet high, arranged in a rectangular pattern. These supports were connected below to 2 oval-shaped catamaran-style pontoons, which formed the lower hull. The pontoons were each 62 feet wide, parallel to each other, and were referred to as the port pontoon and the starboard pontoon. The 8 support columns attached to each pontoon were named and numbered as Port Column 1, Starboard Column 1, and so on. Each pontoon was divided into numerous compartments for ballast tanks, drill water, fuel tanks, a propulsion room, and a pump room. The vessel was classified as semi-submersible because the lower hull was 80 feet below the surface of the water, leaving 50 feet between the water surface and the upper hull. When in position for drilling, 12 45,000-pound anchors were deployed, 3 from each corner support column. Chain lockers were located in the 4 corner support columns. This 12-point mooring system used 1,600 feet of 3¼ inch link chain, connected to 4,500 feet of 3.5-inch wire rope, and was capable of withstanding over 1 million pounds of tension. Overall, the rig had a gross tonnage of 14,913 tons and could conduct drilling operations in up to 3,000 feet of water, drilling 25,000 feet down. 2 3,500 horsepower DC electric motors in each pontoon provided propulsion for the vessel. Detailed schematics and photographs of the Ocean Ranger are available on this episode's page at shipwrecksandseadogs.com if you would like to get a visual reference of the rig. The Ocean Ranger was registered in Panama and placed into service off the shores of Alaska. Prior to 1979, it had been relocated to the eastern seaboard of the United States, and then to Ireland. In 1979, Odeco changed its registry to the United States, which placed it under the maritime regulations of the United States Coast Guard, and was classified as an existing mobile offshore drilling unit. In October of 1979, Odeco applied for the certification of inspection from the Coast Guard. The inspection took place on December 14th of that same year, and generated a couple of noteworthy findings. The Coast Guard noted the lack of davit-launched life rafts for 100% of the personnel on board, or an acceptable substitute, and the need to replace the existing lifeboats and davits with Coast Guard-approved equipment, or obtain approval for the use of the existing equipment. Odeco chose to keep its existing lifeboats and davits, and purchased 2 additional 58-man lifeboats and davits to be counted as an acceptable substitute for the davit-launched life rafts. The Coast Guard issued the Ocean Ranger its certificate of inspection on December 27, 1979, and allowed Odeco until December of 1981 to complete the installation of the additional lifeboats and davits. In November of 1980, the Ocean Ranger was relocated to the Grand Banks off the coast of Newfoundland to drill in the Hibernia oil fields. Odeco leased the rig to Mobile Oil Canada, or MOCAN, and the operation was a joint effort. Its certificate of inspection was valid for 2 years, and on the 27th of December 1981, it expired. Owners of mobile offshore drilling units must request an inspection from the Coast Guard in order to renew their certificates. Odeco had not requested such an inspection, as they were waiting to complete the installation of the additional lifeboats. On January 27, 1982, Odeco finally requested an inspection, a month after their certificate had expired, and the U.S. Coast Guard scheduled the inspection for February 15th. The Ocean Ranger had a crew of 84, 15 Americans, 64 Canadians, and 1 citizen of the United Kingdom. All of the Americans and 31 of the Canadians were employed by Odeco, with the remaining crew being hired contractors. While underway at sea, the barge master was the person in charge of the vessel. This was Captain Clarence House of Baltimore, Maryland. During drilling operations, the senior person in charge was the tool pusher, Benjamin Kent Thompson. However, the people in these 2 positions must carefully coordinate with each other, as operation of such a complex vessel requires the expertise of a drilling expert and an experienced maritime captain. The master of a mobile oil rig, such as the Ocean Ranger, must be licensed and certified by the Coast Guard. However, the role of tool pusher did not fall under the Coast Guard's authority. In practice, the tool pusher is ultimately in charge of the rig and calls the shots. The barge master is left in charge of maritime operations, but often lacked the authority to responsibly carry them out. Clarence House was an experienced mariner serving on numerous tankers and tugs with Bethlehem Steel Company from 1956 to 1971, in a number of positions, including ship's master. In 1978, House was awarded with his unlimited master's license and was hired by Odeco in 1981. He had brief stints on board the Odeco rigs Ocean Victory and Ocean Bounty before being named Master of Ocean Ranger in January of 1982. In addition to a master, Coast Guard regulations stipulate a mobile oil rig must also have a marine crew of 2 able seamen, 1 ordinary seaman, and 1 lifeboatman. In February of 1982, the Ocean Ranger was short 2 able seamen and 1 lifeboatman. Later testimony revealed that Odeco did not typically hire any dedicated marine crew other than the master, and they met personnel requirements with industrial crew who happened to also have corresponding merchant marine licenses. As a result, it was common for the ship's master to be the only crew member specifically dedicated to marine duties. Without question, the industrial operations of a semi-submersible oil rig took precedence over all else. Aside from the obviously haphazard nature of meeting personnel requirements, it created awkward and unusual organizational structure. Industrial workers such as drillers or crane operators would report directly to the tool pusher. But these same crew members also may be serving as an able seaman and reported to the ship's master. This created not only confusion, but conflicts of interest as duties and orders overlapped. While anchored for drilling operations, the master only held authority over the 2 ballast control room operators, who were not required personnel according to the Coast Guard Certificate of Inspection. On the Ocean Ranger, neither of these crewmen held a Coast Guard-issued merchant marine license, nor were they required to have one. The ballast control room was located inside one of the vertical support columns, approximately 28 feet above the waterline. 4 port lights, or glass windows, were located in the walls of the ballast control room, giving the operators a visual line of sight of sea conditions. The watertight port lights could not be opened and were designed to withstand powerful storms and rough seas. Metal coverings, called deadlights, could be closed over the interior of the port lights to provide additional resistance to exterior forces. On November 26, 1981, the Ocean Ranger began drilling in the Hibernia oil field location designated at J-34, 166 miles from St. John's, Newfoundland, in the Grand Banks. 2 other rigs were nearby, the Sedco 706, 8.5 miles to the northeast, and the Zapata Ugland, 19.2 miles to the north. Drilling operations were 24 hours a day, with rotating 12-hour shifts. The typical assignments for crew were 21 days on and 21 days off. As the Ocean Ranger was being refueled during the early morning hours of February 6, 1982, the ballast control operator was relieved by Captain Howes, and subsequently went to the pump room to close the fuel valves. By the time he got to the pump room, the rig had taken on a 5-degree list, and an announcement blared across the rig. All personnel should put on their life jackets and report to the lifeboats for further instructions. The situation was quickly rectified, and the rig stabilized. In a later investigation, it was determined that Captain Howes had improperly opened a tank valve that should not have been opened, which allowed seawater to enter the ballast, causing the rig to list over. The tool pusher, Kent Thompson, was furious and publicly berated both Captain Howes and the ballast control operator. Thompson insisted that Howes should not touch the console again unless he knew what he was doing. Captain Howes agreed, saying, "I think the best thing to do here is for me not to operate the console." Thompson wholeheartedly agreed. On February 13, 1982, a major Atlantic cyclone was centered over Nova Scotia, moving north-northeast directly for the Grand Banks. This storm started as a weak disturbance in the Gulf of Mexico, but passed over the Florida Peninsula and into the Atlantic. It had gathered strength as it traveled north, and by this time it posed a significant threat to the rigs in the Hibernia oil fields. The storm continued to intensify into February 14th as it neared St. John's, with forecasts from the Nordco Weather Agency warning of winds over 60 miles per hour and seas of 20 feet. The crew of the Ocean Ranger knew they were in for a rough time, but the rig was designed to withstand storms such as this, and they had experienced storms like this before. During the morning, Ocean Ranger's standby vessel, Seaforth Highlander, moved into position to support the rig in case of an emergency. On the 14th, winds were 60 miles per hour with gusts over 90 miles per hour and seas averaging 50 feet. The Canadian Broadcasting Company reported, "For most of the 14th, the Ocean Ranger was battered by hurricane-force winds of over 100 kilometers per hour, with waves to 27 meters, the height of a 5-story building." While these vessels were designed to withstand even the most violent storms, the increased motion of the rig posed a problem for drilling operations. Excess lateral motion could damage the drilling equipment, but stopping drilling operations was a very costly decision to make. Regular communications took place between the onshore MOCAN superintendent and the foreman on the 3 rigs. Discussions were ongoing of when and how drilling needed to stop for the safety of the crew and the rig. At 12:00 p.m. on February 14th, the MOCAN superintendent received a call on the Marisat from the Zapata Ugland. A discussion took place for how and when to shear off and how to go about hanging off if necessary. Shutting down an underwater oil well is a complex procedure, but in very simple terms, the well is sealed off by a series of valves called rams in a process called shearing off, and the drilling line is suspended, which is called hanging off, inside of the drilling pipe. Shearing off is a last resort for drilling operations and reserved only for the most severe emergencies. At 2:00 p.m., Mocan received a call from Foreman Jack Jacobson of Ocean Ranger, reporting they were still drilling, 18 feet an hour, and made 78 feet in just over 4 hours. A few minutes later, the Zapata Ugland reported rolling, heaving, and pitching up to 3 degrees and seas up to 27 feet with winds over 70 miles per hour. At 3:45 p.m., the Zapata Ugland reported in again and notified Mocan that they were hanging off with winds now over 115 miles per hour and seas over 35 feet. The Zapata Ugland had stopped drilling and relayed that the Sedco 706 had also stopped drilling. At around 7:00 p.m., tool pusher Kent Thompson contacted Mocan and reported that the pipe was sheared off and they were now hanging off. Around the same time, Jack Jacobson contacted the Sedco 706, saying they were attempting to hang off but were experiencing problems with the equipment. He also reported that a port light was knocked out and water and glass had entered the ballast control room. Presumably, the port light was broken by the force of a massive wave crashing into the support column. The Ocean Ranger had reported waves from 55 to 65 feet at the time, and the port lights were located just 28 feet from the waterline. The evidence of water and broken glass inside the control room indicates that the deadlights were not closed over the interior of the port lights. Just about at that same time, the Sedco 706 experienced a rogue wave that crashed over its port side. Some minor damage was sustained and the rig reduced its draft by 5 feet. Several crew on board the Sedco later testified to overhearing radio communications from the Ocean Ranger, saying they were mopping up water in the control room and picking up glass from the broken port light. At 8:45 p.m., Mocan received a call on the Marisat from Ocean Ranger foreman Jack Jacobson, who reported seas over 50 feet and winds in excess of 100 miles per hour. He again reported the broken port light, but that all was well. Other than cleaning up the water and glass, the rig was experiencing no problems. Many overheard conversations from the Ocean Ranger over this time and testified that the crew were calm, not panicked, and confident. There did not appear to be any concern in their voices. A little after 9 p.m., the control room operators on the Ocean Ranger began having significant problems, as electrical shocks came from some of the controls, and valves began opening and closing on their own. At one point, all the port side valves were opened, allowing water to enter the ballast tanks. The power was then cut to the control room, which forced the valves shut. A routine call to Mocan was placed by the Sedco 706 at 10:50 p.m. to inform the shore operator that the Sedco 706 and Ocean Ranger radio operators were going off air for a coffee break. For the next 40 minutes, no communications were received from either rig. Finally, at 11:30 p.m., the Ocean Ranger made a routine weather report, indicating no problems at all and included no additional information about personnel, equipment damage, or anything else. With the power cut, the valves had remained closed, and while the Ocean Ranger had a small list, it was stable. The crew restored power to the control room shortly before 1:00 a.m. on February 15th. The result of this action caused the valves to open again, and most likely they were not able to close them. As the rig listed farther toward the bow, it lost the ability to pump ballast out of the forward tanks. At 12:52 a.m., the Sedco 706 received a distress call from the Ocean Ranger. Its radio operator recalled during later testimony, "The next thing I heard from the Ocean Ranger, 12:52 a.m., and that was all stations a Mayday, standard Mayday call. The international call Mayday 3 times, all stations 3 times. The Ocean Ranger 3 times stated his position. He had a severe list and he required immediate assistance. At the time that the Mayday was going out, he called me on the Sedco 706 and asked me to put up Maydays on their behalf. I asked him the nature of the problem, and he said they had a severe list, and that is all he said. He kept putting them out every couple of minutes. It went on until 1:30 a.m. when they went to life raft stations." At 1 o'clock a.m., Mocan received a direct message from Ocean Ranger. Jack Jacobson reported an 8 to 10 degree list toward the bow and 75 to 80 mile-an-hour winds. The crew were attempting to solve the problem, but could not determine the cause of the problem. At 1:05 a.m., Jacobson contacted the standby vessel, Seaforth Highlander. "Will you come in a little closer, please? We've got a problem here on the rig. We're listing to port and all countermeasures are ineffective. So if you could, come in close as soon as you can make it." The operator told Jacobson they were on the way, and that was the last communication the Seaforth Highlander received from the Ocean Ranger. Jacobson then placed a call to the Marisat operator, who then connected him to the U.S. Coast Guard Rescue Coordination Center in New York. The following message was transmitted. "We are the Odeco Ocean Ranger and are experiencing a severe list of about 10 to 15 degrees and are in the middle of severe storm. 12 degrees and progressing. Request assistance ASAP. We are an offshore drilling platform. We will stand by as long as possible. Winds at this time are approximately from the west at 75 knots. Jacobson then asked for the standby vessels for the Sedco 706 and Zapata Ugland to make their way toward the Ocean Ranger, and for the supply helicopters to be sent from St. John. If they had to abandon the rig, they would need all the help they could get. At 1:21 a.m., this message was forwarded to the Canadian Coast Guard Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax, Nova Scotia. At 1:30 a.m., their Marisat connection was lost, and attempts to reconnect were not successful. The flurry of transmissions and messages had the mobile headquarters bewildered. Just an hour ago, all was well, and no problems were reported. Now a Mayday call was being broadcast, and they feared the rig and its crew would be lost. A final message was received by Mocan at 1:30 a.m. "There will be no further radio communications from Ocean Ranger. We are going to lifeboat stations." We simply do not know exactly what happened next, but soon after 1:30 a.m., the crew abandoned the Ocean Ranger, and its 2 lifeboats were launched. The Seaforth Highlander was speeding as fast as possible to the Ocean Ranger, as extremely rough seas and high winds slowed its progress. Visibility was poor, but radar was used to locate the rig, until finally it was spotted about a half-mile off. Blinding snow and sea spray continued to make visibility difficult, and the crew was ordered by Captain Ronald Duncan to not go out on the deck. Through the storm, the rig's lights on the deck, its derrick or tower, and its cabins were still illuminated. At 1:50 a.m., small lights could be seen coming from the water, lights from life jackets. A red distress flare was then spotted off the starboard bow, and the Seaforth Highlander changed course to its location. About 3 minutes later, an enclosed lifeboat was spotted, and it became clear that it was operating under its own power. The lifeboat maneuvered itself along the port side of the rescue vessel, and a line with a life ring was thrown down to the men inside, and then secured to the lifeboat. It was at this time it became apparent that the lifeboat was badly damaged, cracked on both sides, and lying low in the water. 5 or possibly 6 men exited the lifeboat and stood along its port side, and tried to get into position to board the Seaforth Highlander. This was difficult, as both vessels were rising high and plummeting down in the rough seas, and moving closer and then farther away with the current. As efforts were made to reach the men, the lifeboat began to capsize to its port side. The crew on the Seaforth Highlander watched helplessly as the men standing on the lifeboat were thrown into the water. At 2:30 a.m., the lifeboat capsized, and about 8 to 10 men were seen in the water, clinging to its side, about 12 feet away. All the men were wearing life jackets with lights and were bobbing up and down with the waves. The Seaforth Highlander was taking a beating, with waves washing over its deck, and its crew was battered and bruised. The water temperature was 29 degrees Fahrenheit, or about -2 degrees Celsius, and the men in the water were not wearing immersion suits. Hypothermia began almost immediately. After just 1 or 2 minutes, the men grasping the lifeboat began to let go, as they lost consciousness and drifted away. Captain Ronald Duncan recalled. At that point, I shouted down to the mate on the deck via the loud bailer system to throw over a life raft. I saw the men running up and forward on my deck to go for the life raft, and they threw it over the side, which inflated right beside the men in the water. No effort was made by any man in the water to grab hold of the life raft. No apparent effort was made by any of the men in the water to reach the lines which my men had been throwing to them after the lifeboat capsized. As the lifeboat and the men in the water continued to drift along the port side and toward the stern of the Seaforth Highlander, Captain Duncan shut down the engines to prevent them from being sucked into the propeller. After the men were clear of the vessel, Duncan brought it back around to attempt a rescue. Again, he recalls, "We could see all the men floating with their heads under the water, some of them with their arms outstretched, no sign of life, and the men on the deck were trying to pick up bodies. We couldn't get close to any of the bodies. It was very difficult. We were washing the bodies away with the motion of the ship, and for the rest of that morning we kept searching for any live personnel which might have been found. We saw many bodies in the water, bodies which had obviously not come from the lifeboat, which had capsized alongside of us, but there were no signs of life at all." The standby vessel for the 706, the Boltentor, and that of the Zapata Ugland, the Nordertor, were also on the way to assist, having been relayed the Mayday call and request for assistance from the Sedco 706. The Boltentor gained visual contact with the rig at 2:45 a.m. and can see it listing at about 35 degrees. It then came around the rig's starboard side and proceeded to the location of the Seaforth Highlander to assist. Captain Jim Davidson of the Boltentor testified, "We attempted to do the normal sideways screw towards where the bodies were. I would say trying to, but there were seas sweeping over the stern and I had to have my men on deck organized. One man would maintain a lookout for the seas coming down so that the boys on deck could actually make themselves secure when one was coming down. But it was very, very stormy, and very bad and extremely cold too. I didn't see any signs of life when we arrived on the scene. A couple of my crew say they thought they saw one of them sort of limply lift an arm a couple of times, but that could have been wave action or it could have been a sign of life. We must have arrived in the location of the bodies at 3:15, 3:20, 3:30, and we were then working until around 6 o'clock when 4 of my men were violently thrown into the winch house. Another one was dumped on top of the tugger, and I think they were all getting pretty scared by this time, and they were achieving absolutely nothing really, although I have every admiration for the attempts they made." At 1:20 a.m., the standby vessel for the Zapata Ugland, MV Nordertor, received a message to proceed to the Ocean Ranger, 21 miles to the south. It was underway by 1:30 a.m., battling through the fierce waves and blistering winds. The rig was spotted on radar at about 13 miles off, but at about 6 to 7 miles out, the rig disappeared from the radar. Between 3:15 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., the Ocean Ranger disappeared beneath the waves. In place of the signal from the Ocean Ranger, 2 smaller blips appeared on the radar. Captain Baxter Allingham pushed on to provide whatever assistance he and his crew could offer. At 3:40 a.m., the Nordertor reached the location of the rig, but there was nothing to be seen other than the empty ocean. Allingham then headed east to join the Seaforth Highlander and Boltentor. At 7 o'clock a.m., Allingham and his crew made visual contact with a lifeboat in the water. It was damaged and overturned and lying low in the water. Allingham pulled his vessel in closer and could see the life ring from the Seaforth Highlander attached to its bow. A line from the Nordertor was thrown out and attached to a large hole in the lifeboat's bow. The crew was able to peer inside the hole to see if anyone was still inside. We could see a number of bodies inside. There were quite a few inside strapped in seatbelts. The chief mate could see right down in it, and he said there were 15 bodies. A number of the bodies exited through the hole in the bow, and one of them washed up onto the deck of the Nordertor. An attempt was made to recover the remaining bodies, but the crew experienced great difficulty when the line to the boat got tangled in the Nordertor's propeller. The line had to be cut, and the sinking lifeboat drifted away. Only one body was able to be recovered from the lifeboat. With it now out of reach and sinking, the Nordertor went to investigate a couple of life rafts that showed possible signs of survivors. Request for helicopter assistance was received by MOCAN from the Ocean Ranger just after 1 o'clock a.m., but the severe weather prevented any immediate response. The first of 2 helicopters arrived on scene at 4:30 a.m., and a second at 4:55 a.m. These helicopters were typically used to transport personnel, parts, and supplies between St. John's and the offshore rigs. They were not equipped for search and rescue, but nevertheless, their crews offered what assistance they could by helping locate men in the water. The 3 ships, along with additional vessels that had arrived, continued searching for the next several days. The lifeboat found by both the Seaforth Highlander and the Nordertor was recovered at daybreak, with 20 men strapped inside, all of them dead. Several empty life rafts were found, and the second lifeboat was found empty on February 16th. Only 22 bodies were recovered, and it was determined that all of them perished due to hypothermia. None of the 84 crew of the Ocean Ranger survived. The Ocean Ranger itself was found in the coming weeks using sonar scans. It was 485 feet southeast of the wellhead, upside down amidst scattered debris. In August of 1983, it was refloated, still upside down, towed out to deeper waters, and sunk. Inquiries into the loss of the Ocean Ranger began almost immediately. The United States Coast Guard, the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, and the Royal Commission of the Canadian government all independently launched investigations. Interviews were conducted and testimony taken from management of MOCAN and ODECO, crews of the standby vessels, crews of the Sedco 706 and the Zapata Ugland, former employees who had worked on the Ocean Ranger, and current crewmen who were not working on the rig at the time. Several issues became apparent to all of the investigating agencies. The Royal Commission determined the sinking of Ocean Ranger was, quote, caused by a chain of events which resulted from a coincidence of severe storm conditions, design inadequacy, and lack of knowledgeable human intervention. Of particular note, the Commission was critical of the location of the control room, just 28 feet above the water, and the vulnerability of its port lights. The Ocean Ranger's lifeboats were both badly damaged as well, citing the need for more durable lifeboats that could withstand such severe conditions. A lack of proper training was also cited by the Commission, supported by the testimony of several witnesses. Max Rulicki was a diver and owner of Hydrospace Marine Services, and one of his contracts was with the Ocean Ranger in 1982. Rulicki testified, "At that time, safety on offshore oil rigs wasn't given much thought. There was no safety or basic survival training. I spent many days on the Ocean Ranger. The lifeboat drill was something that we did every Sunday after lunch. You went out and stood by your lifeboat station and basically had a cigarette and yarned with the rest of the crew. Nobody went into the lifeboat. Nobody started it. In the words of the people that were responsible for the rig, this rig can't sink, and that was the mindset. Why should we be worried about safety?" Bruce Porter, an alternating control room operator on board the Ocean Ranger, was off-duty and not aboard on February 15th. According to Porter, he worked in the control room a few hours a day after his 12-hour shift as a roustabout, or general laborer. He wanted to learn new skills in hopes of being promoted to a higher-ranking position, but was told by Captain Clarence House that he would not be recommending him for training. Just a week later, Porter was hired as a full-time ballast control operator, despite having very little training. Porter recalls, "I was just stunned. I had just been told a few days before that I wasn't recommended to train for this position, yet I was now called on to take over the position full-time." Porter told the Commission he was reluctant due to his lack of qualifications as a ballast control room operator, and that he had never worked on an oil rig before he was hired by ODECO in July of 1981. Porter was promoted from junior ballast control operator to senior ballast control operator, and when House himself almost sank the rig and agreed never to touch the controls again, Porter was left in charge of the ballast controls despite still being in training. The Royal Commission stated an industry failure to implement effective safety systems, including specific rules for the proximity of standby vessels, proper safety gear for all crew members, and lifeboats suitable for an oil rig. They were also critical of the owners of Ocean Ranger, ODECO, and the search and rescue response, citing the 20-year-old supply helicopters that were not outfitted for a rescue operation. A critical deficiency was found in the national standards for safety and found there was no requirement for companies to demonstrate competency of their workforce. The Commission issued 136 recommendations, including a single Canadian agency to regulate the industry, including drilling operations, the production of oil and gas, standby vessels, helicopters, and other rescue craft. As a result, the Canadian government formed the Canada, Newfoundland, and Labrador Offshore Petroleum Board in 1986 to regulate the industry and provide improved safety standards. The Commission also recommended federal funds be allocated for search and rescue technologies and life-saving equipment, which the Government of Canada has provided every year since 1982. The United States Coast Guard investigation concurred with the Royal Commission, stating, "The U.S. Coast Guard Marine Board of Investigation determined that the primary cause of the sinking of the Ocean Ranger was a broken port light in the ballast control room. The broken port light allowed seawater to enter the room, which led to a series of events that ultimately caused the rig to capsize and sink." Additional factors included in their report were lack of proper training, lack of oversight by ODECO, and a complicated regulatory framework. The process of launching lifeboats on oil rigs such as Ocean Ranger during the conditions it was under was found to have contributed to the deaths of the crewmen. The U.S. Coast Guard concluded, "Lowering lifeboats under such conditions from these heights can subject them to violent swinging and severe impact damage if contact is made with the rig structure. A reliable means for controlling this swinging or a more effective launching arrangement would contribute significantly to the ability of the personnel to safely launch lifeboats." The loss of the Ocean Ranger hit the province of Newfoundland particularly hard. Of the 84 lost, 56 were Newfoundlanders. Their loss impacted many friends and coworkers and left many families without a source of income. The Ocean Ranger Monument was unveiled in 1985 at Pippi Park in St. John's, Newfoundland. Designed by Scottish artist Stuart Montgomery, the monument consists of two pillars, connected at the center, and frames the Atlantic Ocean and St. John's Harbor from the top of Confederation Hill. The sculpture includes a plaque listing the names of those who perished in the disaster. A small garden area enclosed by trees surrounds the monument and is named the Ocean Ranger Memorial Garden. That's going to do it for the Ocean Ranger disaster. Thank you so much for listening. If you would like to support the show, you can do so by making a donation at buymeacoffee.com/shipwreckspod or by subscribing to Into History. Get ad-free access to some of the best history podcasts available, plus bonus content, early access, a private Discord forum, and more. Subscribe at intohistory.com/shipwreckspod. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. You can follow the show on social media at ShipwrecksPod and at shipwrecksandseadogs.com, where you can find merch, the entire catalog of episodes, and show notes. Original theme music is by the talented wizard, Sean Siegfried, and you can find him at seansiegfried.com. Please join me again in 2 weeks. But until then, don't forget to wear your life jackets.